There are roster moves that fix immediate problems, and then there are roster decisions that redefine an entire championship window. Sometimes the most calculated plays happen when everyone expects you to panic, when the noise is loudest, when conventional wisdom screams that you need to act immediately. And sometimes the boldest strategy is knowing exactly when to wait for the right moment to strike. Welcome to Lions News Fan Report. I'm your host, and if you're watching this channel, it's because you understand that following the Detroit Lions requires more than just reading headlines. Here you're getting updated news, verified information, and the strategic breakdowns about our beloved Lions that go deeper than surface-level takes. Today, I need to walk you through something that's been developing behind the scenes at Allen Park, something that involves the offensive line that's been more vulnerable than we've seen in years, and something that could represent one of the most aggressive moves this organization makes in the coming months. This isn't about what happened at the trade deadline. This is about what's coming next, and I need you to stay with me because the implications for our Super Bowl chances are absolutely massive. Let me start by addressing the elephant in the room that every Lions fan has been talking about since Tuesday afternoon. The trade deadline came and went, and the Detroit Lions made exactly 0 moves. No edge rusher to help Aiden Hutchinson, no secondary reinforcements, and perhaps most surprisingly, no help along the offensive line, despite Christian Mahogany suffering a broken ankle in Week 9 against Minnesota that will sideline him for a long time, according to Dan Campbell. For a team that's won back-to-back NFC North titles, for a coach as aggressive as Campbell who never shies away from going for it on 4th down, for an organization that traded for Zadarius Smith at last year's deadline, the inactivity felt completely out of character. Fans were confused, analysts were puzzled, and honestly, I was questioning it myself watching that clock hit 0 with no Lions activity reported. But here's the thing about Dan Campbell and this Lions organization that I've learned over the past few seasons. They don't make moves just to make moves. They don't react emotionally to pressure from media or fans, and they absolutely do not panic when things get difficult. Every decision is calculated. Every strategy has layers that we don't see immediately, and sometimes what looks like inaction is actually the setup for something much bigger. And when I started digging into what options were actually available at the deadline versus what could be coming in the next few months, a picture started to emerge that has me genuinely excited about where this offensive line is headed. The Cleveland Browns are in full rebuilding mode right now, sitting at 2 wins and 7 losses, clearly not competing for anything meaningful this season. And when teams hit that point in their trajectory, when the season is lost and the future becomes more important than the present, they start making difficult decisions about veteran players who could bring value elsewhere. 2 names that were circulating heavily around league circles leading up to the trade deadline were guards Joel Bitonio and Wyatt Teller, both multiple-time Pro Bowlers, both still playing at an elite level, both exactly the type of players that could transform an offensive line overnight. According to reports, the Browns were potentially open to dealing one or both of these guys, but here's the critical part that everyone needs to understand. Detroit chose not to make attempts to land either of those players at the deadline. Now, the conventional interpretation of that decision is that the Lions simply weren't interested, that they're content rolling with Tristan Colin and Kingsley Aguakan as depth options behind our starting guards. But I'm here to tell you that interpretation is way too simplistic, and it doesn't account for the strategic reality of how these negotiations work. When you're trying to acquire Pro Bowl caliber offensive linemen at the trade deadline, you're negotiating from a position of desperation. The selling team knows you need help immediately. They know you're under time pressure. They know they can extract maximum value because you don't have leverage. The price gets inflated, you end up giving up more draft capital than you should, and you make a move that might solve an immediate problem, but costs you long-term flexibility. But here's where this gets really interesting, and here's why I think something significant could be developing. The Browns didn't end up trading Bitonio or Teller at the deadline either. Both players are still in Cleveland, both are continuing to play for a team that's going nowhere this season, and both are going to be evaluating their futures very seriously when this season ends. Bitonio is 34 years old and has been one of the most consistent guards in football for over a decade. Teller is 30 years old and at the peak of his powers as one of the most dominant run-blocking guards in the entire NFL. These are not players who want to waste the final prime years of their careers on a Browns team that's clearly years away from contending. And this is where the Detroit Lions could potentially make their move in a much smarter, much more cost-effective way than trading for them would have been at the deadline. Let me paint you a picture of how this could unfold. The Lions wait until the offseason when the Browns have to make real decisions about their roster construction, about which veterans they're keeping, and which ones they're willing to part with for the right price. At that point, the Browns aren't operating under the artificial time constraints of a trade deadline. They're having genuine conversations about what makes sense for their rebuild, and they're much more likely to accept reasonable offers rather than holding out for premium packages. Detroit could swoop in with a trade package that makes sense for both sides, bringing in one or potentially both of these Pro Bowl guards to solidify an offensive line that's taken a step back from the dominant force it was the previous 2 years. And the price in draft capital would be significantly lower than what it would have cost in November, when teams are desperate and prices are inflated. But there's another scenario that's even more intriguing, and it's one that I think Lions fans need to seriously consider. Joel Bitonio could potentially become a free agent after this season depending on how his contract situation shakes out with Cleveland. If the Browns decide they want to move on from his salary and go younger, if Bitonio decides he wants one more chance to win a championship before he retires, the Detroit Lions would be the absolute perfect destination. We're a team that's legitimately competing for a Super Bowl. We're a team with an established offensive system that gets the most out of our linemen. We're a team with a head coach that players universally respect and want to play for. Bitonio signing with Detroit in free agency wouldn't just be a smart football move. It would be a chance for him to finish his career playing meaningful football in January and February rather than watching the playoffs from home. Think about what adding Joel Bitonio would mean for this Lions offensive line specifically. He's played in a zone blocking scheme similar to what we run here in Detroit. He's been to 7 Pro Bowls over his career, which tells you everything about his consistency and excellence. And he's exactly the type of veteran leader who could elevate the younger players around him. We've seen how Penei Sewell has developed into arguably the best tackle in football, partially because he's been around elite players who show him what professionalism looks like every single day. Now imagine Bitonio providing that same mentorship to guys like Christian Mahogany when he returns from injury, showing them the technique details that separate good guards from great guards, bringing that championship mentality that we need when the games matter most in December and January. And then there's Wyatt Teller, who brings a completely different but equally valuable skill set to the equation. Teller is an absolute mauler in the run game, one of those guards who creates movement at the line of scrimmage, who opens up massive holes for running backs, who sets the physical tone that allows teams to impose their will on opponents. We've seen what this Lions offense can do when we're running the ball effectively, when we're controlling the clock, when we're wearing down defenses in the fourth quarter. Now imagine adding Teller to that equation, giving us another Pro Bowl caliber guard who can help David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs get to the second level consistently. The impact on our offensive identity would be transformative, and it would make us even more difficult to defend because teams couldn't just focus on stopping our passing attack. Here's the strategic brilliance of potentially pursuing these moves after the season rather than at the trade deadline. The Lions aren't giving up valuable draft capital that we need to continue building this roster for sustained success. We're not making panic moves that mortgage our future for a short-term fix. We're being patient. We're being smart. We're waiting for the right opportunity to strike when the price is reasonable and the fit is perfect That's exactly how championship organizations operate, and it's a sign of maturity from this Lions front office that they're not falling into the trap of making moves just to appease fans or media who want to see activity. Now, I know what some of you are thinking because I can already hear the skepticism. The Lions just added Jack Conley to the practice squad. They've talked about sliding Colin or Iguakun into starting roles. Maybe they're genuinely comfortable with the internal options they have and aren't planning any major external moves. And look, that's a fair perspective, and those internal options might end up being perfectly adequate for what we need this season. But here's the reality that every honest Lions fan needs to acknowledge. We're not just trying to be adequate. We're not just trying to make the playoffs. We're trying to win a Super Bowl. And when you're competing at that level, when you're going up against teams like the San Francisco 49ers or Philadelphia Eagles, who have elite offensive line play across the board, you need to match that talent or you're going to get exposed in the biggest moments. The loss of Christian Mahogany was a significant blow, not because he was irreplaceable as an individual, but because it exposed how thin our depth is along the offensive line. We went from having a dominant unit that could impose its will on any opponent to having question marks at multiple positions that opponents are going to target and exploit. Dan Campbell acknowledged that Mahogany will be out a long time, which means we're going to be relying on backup-level players in critical situations for the remainder of this season and potentially into the playoffs. That's not a recipe for championship success, and it's exactly why I believe the Lions are already planning their off-season moves to address this vulnerability before it becomes a fatal flaw. Let me also address the financial component, because this matters when evaluating whether moves for Bitonio or Teller are realistic. The strategy of waiting rather than overpaying at the deadline shows maturity and long-term thinking from our front office. And I'm optimistic that when the right opportunities present themselves, Dan Campbell and company will be aggressive in pursuing the pieces we need to win it all. If you want the inside scoop on every Lions move before it happens, if you want analysis that goes deeper than the headlines, you need to subscribe to Lions News Fan Report right now. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you never miss a breakdown, and share this video with other Lions fans who want real insight into where this team is headed. This is where you get the truth about our Detroit Lions, and I want you to be part of this community. Let's bring a championship to the Motor City together. 1. Pride.